everyone. This week we are taking a look at the French Revolution. So, up to this point, we have kind of seen the start of the Enlightenment era where these educated people were coming together talking about how they wanted to see change throughout the world as far as politics and social classes, money, all of these things. And those ideals trickled over to the colonies of North America, where we see the American Revolution and we see the ideals within the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and we end up seeing the United States of America become a new independent country from the British Crown. So, a question that we've asked up to this point is what is the best way to seek change? Through words or actions? Well, the American Revolution, for the most part, they were using words. Okay, they were very influential with the documents that they were sending to the king and producing with newspapers, all of those things. Well, now we're going to take a look at a revolution that where action was used primarily. Okay, so that's the French Revolution, which we're getting into today. So, where in the world are we talking? We always want to take a look briefly at a map so that way we can kind of acclimate ourselves in the globe. Well, in the upper left hand corner, you see that we've got the North American continent. Very roughly, we see Michigan kind of outlined. And then we have England, France, the African continent, what is during this time the Ottoman Empire, and then what is also at this time the Prussian Empire, which we know today to be current day Russia. All right, so again, kind of wanted to keep in mind here on the picture of where in the world are we talking. It's the highlighted country, which is France, where we're looking at today. So before we even get into what really happened with this revolution, we kind of need to set the stage. A country doesn't just go, bam, we're at war with each other. No, there's a lot of lead up that has to happen, a lot of anger, repression, power issues, things like that have to occur before a general population starts to ask for change. So we're going to take a look at the stage in a couple of different ways. We're going to look at causes and effects. Okay, so this is the basic outline of what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to see how the stage is set. We're going to look at the causes leading up to the French Revolution, what happened during the French Revolution, which is all of these different phases that we have here, and then we're going to round it out with Napoleon Bonaparte's reign. So, let us set the stage. Let's take a look here first at this image on the right. Now we see the title is The Political and Social Systems in France. We see a title here on the left which says the First Estate. On the right we see the Second Estate. We see them standing on what looks like a stone which says taxes, and then underneath that stone, which they are both standing on, says the Third Estate. Okay, so let's take a look at their clothing that they're wearing. The person who is a part of the First Estate, they're in primarily black. They have a book in their hands. It's going to be important to the imagery. On the right-hand side, the Second Estate, they have on what kind of looks like military gear, a very fancy hat with a bloom. And then underneath the person below, we can't really see what they're wearing, but we know that they're being crushed by the First, Second Estate, and the taxes. So, knowing going into the French Revolution, we said that there was a lot of these Enlightenment ideas which are traveling around the world, where people are starting to question money, society, who's making all of the decisions within a country. And so out of this is the American Revolution. And this new independence of a country fighting back against a long-established crown, well, this spread hope around the rest of the world where other countries were underneath the control of a monarchy or a king. And so that hope spread to the rest of the world, and the common citizens started to get the idea of, hey, we may be able to rise up as well and ask for change. We started to see in France riots that were occurring because of economic crisis. Now, when I say economic crisis, that means that money was not doing so great. Not a lot of people had money, and actually, the wages were very low, but in order to buy anything, it was really expensive. So, take for example, if we put it into terms today, if I only made like $1 a day as a teacher, but then I had to pay $5 a gallon for gas, that doesn't match up, right? That's a low wage and a really high price for something that I have to have. Okay, same situation here in France. They had low wages for the average person and then really high prices for things that were necessary for life. The social classes within French society were very divided. Okay, so the poor were very, very poor, and the rich were very, very rich. Again, interesting, we're starting to see some common themes among our society today and French society leading up to their revolution. Okay, but overall, it's really important just to know that these Enlightenment ideas were spreading all throughout Europe. Okay, we saw these Enlightenment ideas work in North America. We see the start of the United States out of the American Revolution. And because of that success against a king, right, the King of England for America, other countries underneath that king rule or a monarchy, they start to say, let's ask for change too. We're not happy with the way we're treated. We don't have any money. There has to be something that changes. So, leading into this, we're going to break down the causes and the effects of the French Revolution. So, what led up to that official, yes, we're asking for change, and what happened because people started to change society so quickly. So, looking at our first cause, okay, our first cause of the French Revolution is that society was so divided. Okay, there was an outdated social class system. And you're going to remember back to the last slide where we saw the different estates where the two men were standing on top of a rock and the man was crushed underneath the others and taxes. Okay, so the society in France was divided up into what we call the three estates. Okay, so this is where we have the first estate, right? That person that was in all black holding a book. That was the clergy or the church. Okay, those terms go hand in hand. A clergyman is someone who works for a church. The second estate were the nobles. Okay, so this is the higher up in society. They're typically going to be the more rich within the society. They're the ones that are in control of the government, the military, things like that. So you remember the last image where the guy had on kind of a fancy military suit, the big hat with a plume on it. That was him representing that noble class, the second estate. The third estate is what we call the middle class to the poor. Now, this was also the largest estate. Okay, so you can kind of see here on the right with the graph that we have. In blue is our clergy, which is the first estate. The yellow is our nobility, and our third estate is in kind of that greenish color, or commoners. This is everyone else. This is the majority of society again. So, as far as land ownership, the church owned about 10% of land in France. The nobility owned about 25% of the land in France, and everyone else owned about 65%. Okay, so commoners had most of the land here in France. Now, when we look at taxation, that doesn't match up at all. We see that the clergy and the nobles weren't paying any taxes at all, whereas the third estate was paying 100% of those taxes. Okay, so a little bit of unevenness of what people own versus what people are paying for. So the first estate, the church, did not like Enlightenment thinkers. If you think back to previous weeks when we were talking about Enlightenment ideas, the church and the king didn't like these new ideas coming about because it was challenging their authority. And as soon as people start to challenge their authority, they may not be in control again. And so they were burning books, they were arresting anyone that was speaking out against them. The second estate was trying to cling on to the power that they had under the medieval ages system, which is still basically this system where we have the first estate, second, and then everyone else. And so, because they're so busy trying to hold on to that power, they're trying to get rich, they really weren't a fan of the monarchy. They wanted to have control themselves. So the church is trying to be top dogs, the second estate is trying to be top dogs, and they really left behind everyone else. And everyone else was left to pick up all of the trash. They were left to pay all of the taxes for the entire country, yet they weren't reaping the benefits of all of their hard work and money. Okay, so again, that first cause of the French Revolution is the fact that society very divided during this time. Second cause is national debt. Okay, so how people were spending money was not doing well for France. France was in deficit spending. This is a term you're really going to want to know, especially going into economics class or even just understanding how you spend your own money. This is essentially when the government spends more than it has. Okay, so say you only have $5 in your pocket, but you promise that you will throw a party and you'll spend $10. Well, you spent more than what you had to your name. That's essentially what France's government was doing to itself. So we're going to break down two rulers here that really caused these problems. The first is Louis XIV. Okay, so Louis XIV, he was in power really before even the American Revolution. As people were starting to question these Enlightenment ideas, he was already starting to cause problems in the early 1700s. On the right here, you can see they were spending just lots of money on these lavish halls and building these large empire-like buildings that really did nothing to give back to France or help anyone other than the king. Louis XIV was also known for going to war with a lot of people. Not only did France help the colonists win the American Revolution by funding them, but at the same time as fighting in the American Revolution, they were also fighting Britain back home in Europe, and so war is always going to cost money. France didn't have that money really to spend, but they were still fighting more than what they should have been. So add in the king spending more than he has, add in trying to fund basically two wars at once. Now you have bad crops. Okay, so just bad weather, bad seeds. It didn't really do well for the food of the entire population, which led to riots because the general population was really hungry, and that's just not good for the Commonwealth. Finally, Louis XIV was known for heavily taxing that third estate. If you remember previous slide, we saw that graph where the general commoners, the very poor, they were being taxed 100%, whereas the church and the nobles weren't doing any taxes. Okay? That didn't fare very well for the king, especially when it came to the general population. He was not well favored. Enter in his grandson, Louis XVI. Louis XVI's rule was going to come just fairly after the American Revolution. Okay, so the colonists had already kind of declared war. These ideas of enlightenment, revolution, asking for change are already spurring within the general population of France. Now enter in this really young king. Okay, he actually becomes king only at like 18. He marries a 14-year-old girl. So you have these two teenagers running an entire country that is already not in a great spot. Didn't get any better. Okay, during his rule, he was known for the very same things as his grandfather. He was spending too much. He was passing laws about money that didn't even really help people. And again, throwing these huge parties that just wasted money for France. So during his rule, he actually had a financial advisor, Jacques Necker. Okay, so Jacques Necker, he tried to help Louis XVI come out of this debt, and he proposed, well, maybe we could tax the church. Maybe we tax the nobles. That'll help kind of even out how poor the poor are. Well, Louis XVI didn't like that. He fired him. So now you have a ruler who is spending ungodly amounts against his country, throwing these parties. He's not well liked by the common person. And as soon as anyone tries to speak up against him, they're fired. So you're not adding in a lot of great things for a country and a king to be successful out of. Finally, leading up into the major chaos that becomes the French Revolution is the storming of Bastille. Leading up to this moment, Paris was already kind of tense amongst the general people and soldiers and the king, and there became this rumor that fled around the town, the city, where they heard, oh, the king is moving in his soldiers and he's going to attack the city. And so Parisians became fearful for their lives and fearful for their homes, money, food, and they wanted to take up arms and they wanted to be able to protect themselves. So, in order to protect themselves against the capital, well, where are they going to go? They end up gathering outside of Bastille prison. Okay, rumor has it that Bastille prison held political criminals as well as weapons and gunpowder. So they stormed the prison looking for weapons in order to protect themselves, again, against this rumor that was spread that the king was coming to attack them. And they were trying to release prisoners that they thought would help their cause in government law. Okay, so while these 800 Paris residents are gathering outside, they're demanding weapons in order to defend themselves, they're starting to really attack this building, the commander opened fires on the crowd. And this was a really bad catalyst moment where all of a sudden you have someone who's working for the king now firing into a crowd of people. That upset a lot of the prisoners standing outside. And so that riled them up even more, created a riot, and they broke inside the prison, grabbed that commander, killed his guards, and basically dragged him through the streets and lynched him in the streets of Paris as a moment to say, we as the residents of Paris are no longer going to stand for the treatment that we have been under. We are going to take back protection against ourselves, and this is our official moment of standing up against all of the mistreatment that we have endured over the last couple of centuries. So this day, actually still in history, is celebrated in France. Just like we think of the 4th of July here in America, the Bastille Day is seen the same way in France. Okay, it is seen as a fight against years of abuse, and it is celebrated, again, like I said, just like how we do the 4th of July. Fireworks, parades, wearing the colors of your country, all of these things as a day of independence from mistreatment. So here are some of the pictures of the common day, Bastille Day, again, where you can kind of see those parades that are occurring, everyone flying the French flag, celebrating their independence and standing up against those injustices. Very similar, right, to the 4th of July? So this is going to lead us into the different phases where we have the effects, or now that the Parisians, now that people of France have stood up against their king, what happens now, right? So these are the effects of the French Revolution. We're going to enter into the moderate phase, where we see the National Assembly gathered. So Louis XVI, the guy who was known for firing his financial advisor, known for just being that young king, teenager, not really caring, he gathers the National Assembly. Now, these are different members from all over the country. They come together in order to decide how are we going to make change. They hadn't been gathered in over 175 years, so it was a moment of weakness for the king in front of all of his people of the country. Well, when the Third Estate came to represent themselves, they actually locked the doors on them and did not they didn't allow them to be a part of the conversation of how do we end all of this violence happening in France. So the Third Estate actually goes across the street to what is a tennis court. Okay, so like we think of tennis today, right? So they enter into this sports arena and they make a solemn oath to each other that they will always stand up for each other, they will always work for freedom. This is now called the tennis court oath. You'll read about this later this week. So within the moderate phase, we end up having a new government system, right? Because of this National Assembly coming forward, declaring this oath to each other. The nobles ended up saying, you know what? The system we have, it's not working very well. We'll give up some of our rights, some of our privileges in order to help make everyone more equal. And under the moderate phase, we see a document, which is very important, called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. This document was heavily modeled after America's Declaration of Independence, which we took a look at earlier in this class, where we see that they're stating all men are born and remain free and equal of rights. All men are equal before the law, no matter what social class you're from or how much money you make. There are natural rights that are secure for every citizen, like liberty, property, security, resistance to oppression, and then freedom of religion and taxes. All sounds pretty similar, right? To the rights that were given out in the Constitution and the American Declaration. Okay, so we see a lot of those shared ideals between America and France. Also, during the moderate phase, we see the women really starting to rise up against the injustices. If you noticed in our last slide, right, do you see women included anywhere on equal rights under the law? No, right? Women weren't really considered during this time when it came to law. And so it's really big in history that we see an entire march led by women on the Palace of Versailles, which is where Marie Antoinette and her husband, King Louis XVI, lived. Now, the women, they were marching because they were really angry at Marie Antoinette. She was known for, again, being a very young queen, known for not really caring or talking to the people of her country. She wasn't even born in France. She was not a French citizen. She was from another empire who married in order to have this truce or bond between monarchies. So she wasn't French. She was spending French money, throwing these really lavish parties, and it really upset the people. And it really upset the women because they were working really hard. They weren't able to afford food for their families, yet they were hearing about all of these parties that Marie Antoinette was throwing. So they storm the palace and they sit outside and they demand, we are not going to leave until the king and queen return to Paris. Okay, so they were mad because actually the Palace of Versailles is miles away from the center of the city. They were way off in the countryside, not even having to deal with all of the issues that were happening in Paris. So they storm inside the home of the king and queen and they're looking for Marie Antoinette. They're ready to just kill her. They're ready, again, to just pull her apart because of how much anger is festering among the general population. And thankfully, or not thankfully, depending on which side of history you want to be on, the king and queen were able to escape. So they escape the palace, but they do make an oath and say, yep, we will move back to Paris with you. And from this point on, they essentially become the prisoners of the people. They are no longer able to return back to their home. They're stuck in Paris inside a building, and all of their food and money starts to become more controlled by the people. During the moderate phase, the National Assembly, again, the common people that kind of come together, they vote that they're going to pay off all of the debts by paying off and selling the church lands. So we start to see the common person really standing up against the church, who previously had control over the entire government. Okay, so the church becomes under the control of the government and the people, and they see a new constitution created. So keep in mind here, this is all happening within a time span of like 5 years. Okay, so we're seeing riots, marches, assassination attempts, buildings come in under control. There's a lot of action in a really short amount of time. And we're going to see that is going to create a lot of instability. So, because of all of this change, all of this action that is happening, this fear of revolution is spreading across Europe to all the other kings and queens that have control over countries. So, the King of Prussia and the Emperor of Austria, who are neighbors to France at this time, they come together and they sign this document called the Declaration of Pillnitz. And they send it essentially to all of the citizens of France saying, you guys better cool it. Like, keep your revolution to yourselves. Don't let these ideas spread. And if you keep up what you're doing, we're going to intervene. We're going to come in with our soldiers and we're going to attack you. Now, this was just an empty threat. Nothing really ever ended up happening. Prussia and Austria never really got involved, but they still made this huge statement to the people. Now, following all of this major change all at once in such a short amount of time, we enter into the second effect of the French Revolution. This is called the Radical Days. And this is where we see a lot of the destruction happening throughout the country. In 1772, radicals take control of what's the National Assembly. So again, they create another constitution, so another new set of rules, another new structure for government systems. Again, this is a lot of change in a short amount of time. They extend voting rights to all male citizens, not just property owners. So during the moderate phase, that first effect, we saw the government say like, yeah, we'll give you a little bit of rights, but now the radicals are really coming in and saying, nope, that wasn't enough. Here's all the changes that we are now going to make. During the radical days of the Revolution, King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are executed by guillotine, and we enter into the period called the Reign of Terror. Now, the Reign of Terror was a time when this committee of men were pulled together. They were called the Committee of Public Safety, and they carry out a ton of executions. They hold very quick trials against government officials, members of the military, or anyone that spoke out against them. Anyone who was suspected, they were killed by guillotine. So we have over 17,000 people that are killed by this machine that you see here on the right, which is a large blade that is dropped and cuts off a person's head. Now, the leader of this Reign of Terror was called Robespierre. Robespierre was the leader of the Committee of Public Safety, and he was known for stating, "Liberty cannot be secured unless criminals lose their heads." Okay, so they were out for blood at this point, looking for change, not happy with what was going on. That brings us to the third effect of the French Revolution, which is known as the Directory phase. So up to this point, we have seen the nobles and the church try to give up some of their power to appease the general population. General population didn't take that. We get into the radical phase where they just start killing every leader who was in charge of France during this time, which leads us into the Directory phase, which is once again another new form of government. Now, under this form of government, there was a two-house legislature, or a group of people who would make laws. We have the Council of 500, so 500 men that would come together and make the law, and then the Council of Ancients. And these were the older men of the population, they'd been around the block kind of a thing, and they would either approve or disapprove any proposed law that came out of the Council of 500. And then you can think of the five-man directory as like presidents. So like how we have the president, it's a one guy show kind of today. In France, it was a council of 5 men who would make all of the decisions for the country. So under this directory phase, the main people that were in control were the middle class or the bourgeoisie. Okay, so you may have heard the term maybe in social slang today as being bougie, right? That comes from this term, which is middle class or higher middle class people who are trying to be fancy or trying to be higher up than what they were born into. So these new leaders, they tried to heal France and they just completely failed. They were keeping the money to themselves, and again, the prices of food rose up again and we start seeing more riots again. So we're seeing this constant cycle of change, fail, death, fail. And so France is really digging itself into a really dark hole throughout the late 1700s. Okay, so in an election in the late 1700s, we have a constitutional monarchy and there's just complete chaos. They can't decide on who is going to lead the country, and they end up turning to Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, Napoleon was a cherished military hero. He was known for being like very strong, very to the point, and they believed, yep, this is the guy who's going to reunite France and bring us back together. Okay, so underneath Napoleon, during life, Napoleon enacted what's called the Napoleonic Code. Like I said, Napoleon was known for being a very strong ruler. He actually ends up declaring himself as emperor, if that gives you any clue as to how he ruled. So underneath his rule, during the Napoleonic Code, men had complete authority over their wives. Any money, where they went day to day. Okay, so women completely lost any power that they previously had tried to gain during the fight for equal rights. Napoleon spent his time in control of France, trying to expand the empire. He tried to expand all the way down into the Ottoman Empire, over to Prussia. He was known for basically invading other countries with France's empire and taking over control. Now, he ended up going to war with Russia, and Russia's not really a country that you want to go against. Okay, Russia uses this tactic called scorched earth policy, where they just completely burn everything in their way and leave nothing behind for the enemy. Russians are known for being able to handle the cold climate, the lack of food or the type of food that they're able to grow within a colder climate, and it basically starves out anyone who tries to invade their empire. And so because Napoleon was expanding so quickly, was trying to be this strong empire, expand France, going to war with Russia, he completely fails. He's not able to hold up against the cold climate. His men are starving, they're tired from all of his expansion tries, and he ends up being defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. He gets exiled off to another country, and we don't really hear from him again. Okay, so after Napoleon, France is just kind of left stumbling around in the dark. They aren't really attempting a new government system. They don't really have a strong leader in control anymore. And they kind of bumble around for the next 50 to 60 years. Okay, so throughout the 1800s, we don't hear much out of France because they're just so lost in form of who's in control, what laws are, who do we follow, all of that. And so we're not going to hear much more out of France from this point on up until more current day situations. So it's always interesting to see how does the American Revolution pair up against the French Revolution. So let's take a look at some of the similarities and the differences. Similar issues between the two revolutions is the issues over debt, right? In the American Revolution, they were fighting about taxation and being taxed by the king over things like sugar, tea, Stamp Act, things like that. Same thing was happening in France, where they were upset. The Third Estate was upset about taxation, the king spending too much. So very similar issues when it comes to money. Both revolutions were against kings. Okay, so the King of England, the King of France. And out of the two revolutions, we see constitutions created, where there are written agreements about what rights people have and what the role of the government is going to be. Now, differently though, they had different results as far as government and what set up. In America, there was created a democracy, where every single person had a voice in what laws were going to be created. In France, there's a constitutional monarchy, where, yeah, you have your rights written down, and that can't really change, but there's still a monarchy. There's still one person in control making all of the decisions for a country. Remember back to that question of like, what is a better way to make change, words versus action? Well, we see that in the American and French revolutions. In America, they were known for fighting for the words. French is much more about the actions and riots. They both were fighting for different things. They wanted a different outcome. In America, they were all about ideas and, very, very poetic about what their revolution was going to be about. Whereas France was much more like, it's just straight up money, it's how we're treated, it's the social class structure, that's got to change. Okay, so much more poetic versus just straight up, here's the issues. All right, I hope to hear from you guys soon. If you have any questions, please let me know.